Welcome to Things You Don't Know. Today, we're tackling something so ordinary that most of us only think about it when the price sign changes at the corner station. What am I talking about? Gasoline. And we're going to treat it like a historical artifact because it is. Our guiding questions are when and who invented gasoline? And why would anyone invent such a thing? Then we'll add a second layer that people ask about all the time. Leaded versus unleaded gasoline. What changed and why? So, Dr. Deneen, give me some surprising information about gasoline just to start us off.
Glad to, Dr. Weaver. The first surprise is that gasoline wasn't invented the way a telephone was invented.
Really?
It emerged out of petroleum refining. In the early days of the oil industry, the big prize was kerosene for lighting lamps, and gasoline range liquids were produced along the way, but they were basically treated as inconvenient or dangerous leftovers. The U.S. Energy Information Administration describes that dynamic very plainly. It says, after the commercial oil industry began in the mid 1800s, gasoline showed up as a distillation byproduct, but it wasn't immediately valued. Now, Chandler, you had some surprise about that.
Yeah, that's pretty wild to me, Dr. Janine, because to date, it feels like oil exists for gasoline. But back then, it was more like we're trying to light homes and streets. Now, but why did we end up with this extra super flammable liquid? Gasoline becomes important only after something else arrives that wants a fuel that vaporizes easily. The internal combustion engine, and eventually mass transportation. Now, Dr. Weaver, I believe you had some things to say about what gasoline really is, didn't you?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, Chandler. So let's start off sort of saying it very simply. Gasoline is a refined petroleum product, really a kind of blend of hydrocarbons because it stores a lot of energy, stays liquid in normal temperatures, and vaporizes enough to mix with air and ignite inside a spark ignition engine. What's the significance of that? Well, engines don't burn liquid efficiently. They don't. The gasoline that you put in your car, yeah, that's not the liquid doesn't go there. It becomes vaporized and then it ignites quite efficiently. So they burn the fuel vapor mixed with oxygen. Don't you think that's kind of interesting, Dr. Deneen?
It is. Putting on my historian's hat here, I can say that volatility was a double-edged sword. Compared with kerosene, gasoline is lighter and more prone to evaporating and igniting. In the 19th century world, it was full of open flames, wooden barrels, and extremely weak or non-existent safety regulations. That wasn't automatically a benefit. It could be a real hazard. Chandler, you were going to talk about gasoline's famous trait.
Well, Dr. Deneen, gasoline's most famous trait is that it ignites easily. And that trait is also exactly why it didn't start out as a hero product.
What do you mean by a hero product? That doesn't make sense. Gasoline as a hero?
Yeah, well, it didn't make sense, and that's kind of why it didn't start out that way. But it did become valuable, Dr. Weaver, when people built machines that could harvest that volatility inside controlled systems, sealed tanks, fuel lines, and engines designed to turn controlled combustion into motion. Now, something that has always interested me, Dr. Weaver, is Who exactly invented gasoline? Do you happen to know a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, and Chandler, when we were talking about this last night, actually, that was the fire that was ignited because I believe I asked you, so do you know who invented gasoline? And you went, no.
I was like, no. And I've always kind of thought about who did, and I've always been interested in where it actually came from.
And I thought about it and I said, nah, I don't know either, dude.
Yeah, you did say that.
Yeah. So if someone wants a single name like the inventor of gasoline, the honest answer is there isn't one. Gasoline is a fraction of crude oil that becomes a standardized product through industrial refining. And I know Dr. Deneen has something to say about commercial oil production in the mid 1800s, huh?
Yeah, a landmark in that story is that the early refining, as the EIA said, focused heavily on kerosene and actually took place in Pennsylvania and the mid-Atlantic states. And gasoline was produced in the process, but it was a byproduct without a strong market at first. Chandler, you were going to explore that a little further.
So, what you're saying, Dr. Deneen, is the invention is really a chain reaction. Crude oil production grows. Refining separates it into useful parts, and gasoline sits around waiting for its perfect match. It's like a key that existed before there was even a lock. Now, Dr. Weaver, why would anyone want gasoline? Why would anyone want to use this newly
Well,
found substance?
yeah, that's a really good question. So here, let's talk about what that lock is. Spark, ignition, internal combustion engines. They need a fuel that can vaporize, mix with air, and ignite reliably. In the late 1800s, engine design crossed a threshold where internal combustion becomes a practical alternative to steam for many different kinds of uses. And I know, Dr. Deneen, you've mentioned a couple of times to me somebody named Otto.
Yes, Nicholas Otto. He's central to this whole discovery. The Britannica Encyclopedia describes him as the engineer who developed the four-stroke internal combustion engine. That's the grandfather in an enormously influential design for later engines.
Yeah, it is really important. And I know Chandler has something to say about that.
Well, once the design is viable, then liquid fuels become incredibly attractive. Steam needs bulky boilers and water. Early electric vehicles ran into limits of batteries and infrastructure, but a liquid fuel in a tank, now that's portable energy. So the reason that anyone would want gasoline is mobility, energy that you can carry.
When
Now,
you were
when
talking
did this
about that,
become?
when you were talking about that, I'm sorry to interrupt you,
No, that's
but
all right.
you said something about a four-stroke internal combustion engine. Now, that's really significant and important because what are the four strokes? Well, okay, so the first stroke is the cylinder pulls down and it sucks air into the cylinder head. And along with that, it sucks in vaporized gasoline, the vapors. Then it goes up and it compresses it. So that's a third stroke. And then kabam! It ignites and it explodes and shoots it down. That's that's the fourth stroke. But they needed that kind of thing that would just automatically just vaporize like that and be able to be used. I'm sorry to interrupt you there, sir.
No, that's actually pretty interesting, Dr. Weaver. And something else that I think that's interesting. Thank you for sharing that, by the way. But something else I find interesting is when did gasoline? really start becoming valuable? Did it have something to do with the early vehicles?
Well, yeah, here's a detail that shows how messy, really messy this was. Early vehicles didn't always use gasoline exactly as we buy it today. The famous Benz patent motor wagon, or patent Motorwagen, is often described as running on lingoin, a petroleum fraction similar to gasoline range products, but different. And I know Dr. Deneen has something to say about.
I do. Uh, we did a podcast on the early development of automobiles you might want to check out. And also, Carl Benz's Path Matters for Bigger Arced Vehicles. Mercedes-Benz corporate history notes that Benz developed a stationary gasoline engine on New Year's Eve,
Happy New
1879.
Year.
And that helped fund his push toward a more lightweight car powered exclusively by gasoline. Chandler, I know you were going to talk about gasoline as a mass product.
Well, it becomes real as a mass product when automobiles scale up. The EIA notes that gasoline was not recognized as a valuable fuel until the 1890s. So basically, that's when the automobile era was becoming large enough to turn refineries' leftovers into a commodity that people actively sought. Now, Dr. Weaver, you and I were also talking about this last night, and when you brought this up, I found it quite important, and I am glad that we're actually talking about this part. Why don't you tell us a little bit about leaded gas versus unleaded gas?
Well, yeah. The big twist in the gasoline story for much of the 20th century, a lot of gasoline contained lead, specifically tetraethanol lead, as an additive. hmm The point wasn't poisoning people, which it was doing quite nicely. The point was solving an engineering problem called engine knock. You've heard engine knock before, whether you recognized it as such or not, but the engine kind of goes tuck, 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 like that. It's a knock. So why don't you say a little bit more about that, Dr. Neen?
Sure, knock happens when fuel air mixtures ignite in uncontrolled ways under compression. It reduces efficiency and potentially damages engines. In the early 1920s, researchers at General Motors found that adding tetraethyl lead dramatically reduced knock. A man called Thomas Migley Jr. is widely credited with that breakthrough in 1921. And he came up with the marketing name ethyl because he didn't want to emphasize, for obvious reasons, the word lead.
So, leaded gasoline was originally not a fuel upgrade for drivers, Dr. Deneen. It was an octane slash NOx solution that let engines run smoother and over time supported higher compression performance. The tragedy is that the health hazards were not a mystery for long. The EIA notes that health hazards associated with lead were documented early, and the issue stayed on the public health radar for decades.
Then comes the turning point, emissions control technology. When catalytic converters became part of the U.S. passenger vehicles in the mid 1970s. Lead was a deal breaker. Lead damages catalytic converters. The EPA describes how unleaded gasoline was required to protect catalytic converters that would appear on many new vehicles, cars, starting in like around 1975 or so. And that is a policy thing that Dr. Deneen, you had something to say about.
Yes, the policy pathway matters here. I remember my grandfather's 75 Dodge Dart had a catalytic converter. He was very proud of it. But the EPA archives materials note that on January 10th, 1973, just 6 months before the first oil crisis, the agency required the general availability of at least one grade of unleaded gasoline by July 1st, 1974. And this is specifically tied to protecting catalytic converters in upcoming model year vehicles.
So, Dr. Deneen, for a while, it wasn't an overnight flip, was it?
No, there was ads at the time emphasizing leaded versus unleaded gas.
Absolutely. And it was more like a guided transition. New cars needed unleaded gasoline. Stations had to sell it, and lead content was reduced over time until leaded fuel for on-road vehicles basically disappeared. The EPA notes that by the 1990s, leaded fuel was a tiny fraction of gasoline sales. And then the Clean Air Act banned leaded gasoline effective January 1st, 1996.
Yeah, and that is why modern regular, mid-grade, and premium is not about lead anymore. Those are octane grades. Today, octane is achieved through refinery processes and blending components rather than lead additives for on the road gasoline. Now, you know, gasoline didn't just appear. Society built a whole system for it before it really became something ubiquitous. Once gasoline becomes central, you need repeatability. Engines don't like surprises. That pressure drives more consistent blends, safer handling, and predictable performances. And Dr. Denny, you have something to say?
I do. It creates an entire system. That's when gasoline becomes infrastructure. You need storage tanks and pipelines and service stations and pumps, standards, and enforcement. You ever want a really interesting video series? Watch Daniel Yergin's The Prize. It's all about the oil industry, brilliantly done. But historically, that's the moment this substance stops being a product and becomes a system that shapes everyday life and national strategy. Chandler, you had something to say about culture.
Yeah, Dr. Deneen, it also changes culture. You don't just buy fuel, you plan around it. Commuting patterns, road trips, where businesses cluster, how cities sprawl. Gasoline becomes the quiet assumption under modern mobility. And Dr. Weaver, why did gasoline dominate?
Gasoline dominated because it hit a sweet spot. It was easy to store, energy dense, workable in relatively small engines, and compatible with mass manufacturing once the internal combustion engine matured. It kind of became the bloodstream of 20th century mobility. In addition to that, you mentioned, Chandler, how cities sprawl. Okay, so why did that happen? Well, if you could get from out in the suburbs to into the city on your own and easily and quickly, which the automobile allowed you to do, then you could have a more palatial home.
But that dominance came with costs: pollution, public health harms like lead exposure, and long-term climate implications. The leaded to unleaded transition is one of the clearest examples of how a performance fix can become a large-scale public health problem, and conversely, how regulation plus technology can unwind it over time.
And now, Dr. Deneen, we're watching another transition: electrification, alternative fuels, changing rules, changing economics. Even if gasoline remains important for a long time, its story is already showing us a pattern. What starts as a byproduct can become a world system, and what becomes a world system could eventually be replaced when society decides that the trade-offs are too expensive.
If you remember one sentence from this episode, let it be this. Gasoline wasn't invented like a gadget. It was promoted from byproduct to powerhouse by engines that demanded portable, vapor-friendly fuel.
And the leaded versus unleaded chapter shows how that powerhouse was repeatedly reshaped, first for engine performance, then for emissions control, and ultimately for better public health.
Now, next time you hear that nozzle click, you're not just buying fuel. You are touching a century and a half story of refining, engines, policy, and the constant negotiation between convenience and consequences.
Well, thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you'll come back and join us again. So for Chandler Foster and Dr. Deneen and myself, I say goodbye until next time.